Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back. It has not just been a Christmas break, but an illness break for me, considering that I was laid out with throat infection for a few days, so I apologize for my absence in that regard. But I come back to you now, and it has been, in a strange sense, a lot going on. But in another sense, of course, it's entirely consistent in terms of the last several days of pretty much the same business going on, but with a couple of additions. So what I'll do is I'll want to start off by talking about, of course, a wretched anniversary that occurred in recent days, which is the 32nd anniversary of the dissolution of the USSR by the Gorbachev-Yeltsin clique. And, of course, this prompts a good deal of reflection in communist circles, which, of course, it should. And I wanted to not let this pass without offering my own comments on it, because it's something that, of course, many of us go back to over and over again and look at and try to analyze. And I'm open about the fact that my own analysis on it is a constantly evolving enterprise, shall we say. It's a constantly evolving and moving piece, because or the more I read and the more I reflect upon the events of 1991 and what led up to it, the more I hope I can find some kind of clarity around it. Because when I first started to consider myself as a Marxist-Leninist, it became perhaps too tempting to merely throw everything onto the wretched and treacherous shoulders of Gorbachev or Yeltsin or any of the others from the late period USSR and pin it all on them as to the reasons behind the collapse. And of course, they deserve their share of the responsibility here. They are, without doubt, some of the primary instigators of the collapse. But as I've said before, it would not have been possible to do all the things that Gorbachev and Yeltsin later on did, and of course their many collaborators, without a serious problem being present inside the CPSU as well. Just look at how many people, how many criminals within the later period USSR and within the post-Soviet states had very long and very well decorated careers within the CPSU. It's not just, of course, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, it's others too, such as, of course, Anatoly Chubais and Anatoly Sobchak, two notorious gangsterist figures, two notorious pirates, two notorious thieves, and their associates, who were, of course, long-time members of the CPSU hierarchy. Yeltsin himself, of course, was a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union for almost 30 years, between the early 1960s and he only left, I believe, in 1990. No, in 1989, I believe he left the CPSU. So he was a party member for the bulk of his adult life. And again, not just Russians either, Ukrainians too. Leonid Kuchma, long-time, deeply crooked president of Ukraine, the man who rigged several elections against the Communist Party of Ukraine, the successor organization to the CPSU in Ukraine. A man who is maybe more than any other single political leader responsible for the unholy mess that Ukraine is in today, given the length of his, not just his time in office, but his influence, given that he was the man at the center of oligarch rule in Ukraine for 2 decades, and the man who ushered back in the influence of the Banderists, of course, with the added assistance of the imperialists, but a man who again had a very long career inside the Ukrainian section of the CPSU, a man who had a very distinguished career as a manager of a major industrial concern in Soviet Ukraine. So the question of who is responsible, of course, becomes more and more complicated when you look at just how many people who were responsible not just for the counter-revolution of what you would, depending upon how you want to date it, but I will say that the definitive counter-revolution, i.e. its end game, goes between 89 and 91, and its immediate aftermath and the destruction of the Soviet legacies. All of these people were integral to the Soviet state. There were very few of them who rose to power in the late 80s and even in the post-independence world 90s, who marched straight out of external exile, straight out of a CIA office and into the presidential suites. Those came later. The initial period where all the damage was done by men of the CPSU. And so when I did that political obituary of Gorbachev, which I basically had a plan and then just ended up ranting for an hour, I think I neglected just how bad things were inside the CPSU and the length of the counter-revolutionary process, because it should not have been possible for Gorbachev to dissolve the power of the CPSU. What should have happened to Gorbachev in 1989 is what did happen to Zhao Ziyang and others like him inside the Communist Party of China, who tried to do the same thing during the events that took place centered on Tiananmen Square. And fortunately for not just the proletariat of China, but also the large section of the world, Zhao Ziyang and others were thwarted and forced into exile, lost their party positions. That is what should have happened to Gorbachev. As soon as he went down the route that he was traveling, he should have been, and as soon as the chaos and disintegration that set in became obvious, or the what the effects that he was having were becoming obvious, and that was clear in terms of the nationalist problems inside the constituent republics as early as '88. Never mind before you got to the dissolution of the CPSU as the ruling party in '89 to '90. So as soon as it became obvious that that was the way that it was going, that the union itself was threatened, Gorbachev should have been removed and should have been arrested. But nobody ever did that. And here we have a unfavorable comparison between the CPSU and the CPC, even with the revisionist leadership of the CPC. And Deng Xiaoping, of course, is a revisionist and had always been a revisionist. But to go along with the thesis as outlined by Hapal Bra in his book Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, there remained a strong opposition to the revisionists within the CPC, which was never removed for all the defeats and reverses that the proletarian revolutionary wing of the CPC suffered between probably the end of the 1960s with the death of Lin Bao and the turn of the Cultural Revolution in an ultra-left and ultra-sectarian direction. And at some point soon I will do a proper assessment of that. But even with the defeat of the Cultural Revolution, the defeat of the Gang of Four, what you find is that the revolutionary wing they represented, for all its flaws and its undoubted mistakes, retained enough power within the CPC to stop outright liquidationism and dissolution, the attempt to dissolve the party or to remove its power. And that, of course, is a product of the genuine renewal that went on in the CPC during the Cultural Revolutionary process. The reviving and the strengthening, I would argue, of the party's links with the working masses in China, and the strengthening of its revolutionary wing, and the putting the fear of the masses back into the revisionists. By the time Gorbachev and co. Are able to maneuver themselves or be maneuvered into power in the USSR, there is no more involvement of the masses, really, on any kind of basis in the party and the state. There is some, but it's very, very limited. And the Gorbachev period is, of course, about destroying any final and lingering element of control that the masses had over the party. And when they couldn't quite do that, then sought to remove the party from its role in the leadership of the state. But very much completing a process begun, of course, by Khrushchev. But broadening this out more and looking at, well, what was it that collapsed in a stinking pile of treachery in 1991? Well, what actually collapses is, of course, not just revisionism in terms of the Soviet Union, but revisionism in terms of also, and intricately connected to the Soviet Union, the revisionists in the people's democracies, of course, but also, very importantly, revisionism in the Western European communist parties of the so-called EU states, NATO states, the imperialist powers. The communist parties there exercised enormous influence, not only inside their own countries, but also back within the USSR itself. So, revisionism in France, in Italy, in Germany, in following the collapse of the Francoist rule in Spain, in Britain, not only had a devastating impact internally, but also that impact, due to their support for social democracy, worked its way back over into the USSR again. And that revisionism, of course, begins in 1945. It begins as soon as World War II ends. And what it does is it takes the various European communist parties back on a route towards the same path that was trodden by the early reformists in the period of the Second International. In fact, the same process plays itself out. If you look back at the Second International, particularly at the German party, being the largest, being the party that was, if not the party of Marx, certainly the party that Marx and Engels had the most followers within and the most influence over in its early period. And yet, within really 15 years or so of Marx's death and immediately after Engels' death, the revisionist trend presented itself openly and very strongly. And the interesting thing to note at this stage about that, in terms of its frontman being Bernstein, but it having the very deep roots within, of course, the trade union bureaucracy, the upper layers of the working class, etc., and of course within the parliamentary office holders of the social democracy in Germany. The way in which this manifests itself is, of course, support for what Lenin referred to when he was as economism, as support for spontaneism, as the backing for the openly reformist road to socialism. And all of these things, of course, are strongly supported by, as I say, the higher paid higher income levels of the German working class, the trade union bureaucracies that are, of course, attached to the Social Democratic Party, and, of course, the parliamentary fraction of the Social Democratic Party, all combined together to create not just reformism through Bernstein, he was just the open manifestation of it, but the reformist mentality and an anti-revolutionary, anti-communist mentality, personified, of course, by not just Bernstein and his successors, such as the political leadership of people like Friedrich Ebert, Philipp Scheidmann, Gustav Nosk, and others, those who, of course, conspired and successfully murdered Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, but also with, of course, Kautsky himself, who, as you can see through his polemics with Lenin, by the time you get to the Bolshevik Revolution, the Great October Revolution, Kautsky has become a vehement anti-communist and remained one for the rest of his life. And so, of course, Lenin was initially shocked by the social chauvinism of the entirety of, other than Liebknecht and Luxemburg, of the hierarchy of the German SPD in World War I, but came to understand it and give a comprehensive analysis of it, which is, of course, that all of these people had become invested in terms of having a class interest in German imperialism, and it made them hostile to the revolutionary German workers, and of course hostile to any other form of revolution, any other form of challenge to German imperialism. Kautsky would be mealy-mouthed about it and hide behind pacifistic sloganeering, whereas others, such as Ebert and his leadership group, would just be openly and rabidly chauvinistic, as they were in World War I. Now, how does this relate to post-World War II? Well, you look at principally looking at the communist parties of Europe, and you see exactly the same process going on. And what you have there is that particularly the French Communist Party rapidly turned towards reformism, compromised with de Gaulle, who of course was the initial president of the post-Nazi occupation government. But more than compromise with de Gaulle, you end up with the French Communist Party, of course, backing the continued occupation of Algeria. Why? Because the French Communist Party has become like its German equivalent of 40 years previously. It's become integrated into the system of management of the French bourgeois state. Its hierarchy has bought into the concessions that the French bourgeois were obliged to make after World War II. It's the hierarchy of the French Communist Party has embraced those to the point where it has become openly reformist. And because it has become openly reformist, it has become to associate itself with not the overthrow of French capitalism, but the better management of French capitalism. French capitalism, of course, is an imperialist system, that requires high degrees of profitability to survive, and thus, as the French Communist Party leaders, and like their second international collaborators, led by, of course, later Mitterrand, come to identify that success, in inverted commas, with, of course, the defense of the French imperial possessions, such as in Vietnam and such as in Algeria. So you end up with the so-called communists supporting a French imperialist war against the national liberation struggle. That's not all the communists, of course. Those aligned with the likes of Sartre, of course, passionately supported Algerian liberation. But the French communists, the leaders of them, had become revisionists and rotten to the same point that the German SPD had. And that was, of course, not fully understood, perhaps at the time. But by the time you get around to 1968, the French communists do an enormous service to the French bourgeoisie by coming out and demobilizing the working class in 1968 and making sure that there is no revolution, just as the Italian communists do the same thing. The parties had been integrated into the capitalist states in the same way that their second international equivalents were. They had become completely revisionist and in the immediate period after World War II. They completely sold themselves and their working classes that they represented and sought to organize at one point to the ruling classes in return for the post-World War II concessions. Now, one might say, and this was said at the time, that, oh, well, concessions had been made, there was no mood in the working class to fight for revolution, we had to consolidate, take the concessions while they're on offer, and then seek to rebuild working class power. Now, you may say that, and some, of course, did, but what you find is that there is one of the hallmarks of revisionism is, of course, that it is also very dogmatic. So when, after World War II, in the immediate aftermath, Stalin and the Moscow Cominform leadership starts to say things like that maybe it's possible for, say, Britain to undergo a peaceful transition to socialism, which is something that the Moscow leadership did say in the immediate aftermath of World War II for a variety of reasons. When that was said, and the bourgeoisie were making a lot of concessions, perhaps you could understand it. But the British communist leaders took that, which was, of course, only ever a temporary situation brought on by the extreme weakness of the British ruling class after it was facing bankruptcy post World War II and potential working class revolt. It needed to make concessions. So what do they do? They make the concessions and they hope then to pacify the militant stance of the working class at the time. So that's what happens. But the communist leaders took that temporary scenario and fetishized it. They turned it into their entire operating system, their operating guidance. Hence the British Road to Socialism in 1951 essentially institutionalizes, instills inside the British Communist Party, the Communist Party of Great Britain as it was once called, the idea that there would only be a bourgeois parliamentary road to socialism, which of course Stalin never believed would be the case. He and the leadership said that it might be possible at a certain point, given the number of concessions that were made up to about 1948. But Stalin would never have stuck dogmatically to that thesis when it was proven to be incorrect. Now, this is what happens with all the revisionists after World War II. They dogmatically, all the way through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, stuck to the idea, and beyond into the 80s, that there would only ever be a parliamentary road to socialism. That's what the British Communist Party stuck to. It's what the French stuck to, and it's what the Italians stuck to. And in the case of Spain and Portugal, they became dogmatic about the idea that the only way forward was not through revolution, not through socialist revolution, even when one was on the cards with the overthrow of first the Portuguese fascist regime and then, of course, the collapse of the Francoist regime. It was to limit demands only to the restoration of bourgeois democracy, despite the fact that the mood amongst the masses was arguably there to go much further. So here you have an example of how the dogmatism and opportunism go hand in hand together. It was dogmatism around a hysterical defense of the bourgeois state, albeit dressed up in various fancy phrases about so-called democracy and democratic traditions and rule of law and a myriad of other things that the Communist Party leaders back in the day would babble on about. Now, the point I'm making here is that what collapses, not just in the Soviet Union, but with the death of the Italian Communist Party, its suicide, shall we say, in 1991 isn't just the USSR, isn't just their form of revisionism. It's an entire revisionist strand, which begins at least in 1945. You could possibly argue earlier, but let's take that as a solid starting point. And degenerates all of the communist parties in Europe for decades upon decades until you get the final degeneration after the early 1970s, the beginning of and the emergence of Euro-communism, particularly in Italy and France and Spain, and that final collapse into open advocacy of social democracy, the abandonment of even the verbal pretense that the commitment to the dictatorship of the proletariat was being preserved, and then final implosion 89 to 91. So what collapses in 1991 isn't just Khrushchevite revisionism inside the USSR. It's an entire period of revisionism which has its roots, again, in the period after World War II. And what it reflects is the fact that the concessions made by the ruling class after World War II come off for the ruling class because they're in an incredibly weak position in 1945, not just in France and Italy, but also Britain. US imperialism, of course, is obliged to underwrite much of these concessions and has to employ the services of the Social Democrats principally, but also to purchase the services of the communist parties in order to preserve the capitalist states of Western Europe and Britain. And that's exactly what happens. Of course, the Labour Party in Britain had long been in the service of British imperialism for at least a generation before 1945. And the Communist Party was happy to join them in that. And therefore, we come to a fundamental problem, which is that we have gone through two internationals now, the second and the third, talking purely in European terms. Outside of Europe, of course, is a different scenario. But here we're talking about the Soviet collapse and the influence of European revisionism upon it. What you get is, of course, the European parties, rather than being centers of working class militancy, become centers of revisionism even before Khrushchev's notorious and treacherous speech of 1956. And so what the European parties are feeding back into the Soviet Union post 1945 is not a strengthening of revolutionary tradition. It's a relentless social democratic deviation. Now, when Stalin said that social democracy was objectively the moderate wing of fascism in the early 1920s, what did he mean? Well, of course, he means that the social democrats had become a mere method of rule of the bourgeois. And as the bourgeois as a class moved towards fascism, therefore the social democrats moved towards fascism right along with them. And this is exactly what happened in the 1920s. The more towards fascism the bourgeois turned, the more pro-fascist the social democrats, or at least the social democratic leaders, became more and more openly pro-fascist. So when a process occurs, which I've just been talking about, whereby the Communist Party leaders in the post-World War II era become part of the management structure of the bourgeois states in Western Europe and Britain. When they take that turn, they have effectively become the same as their Second International predecessors. They are taking a turn towards being not just revisionist, but also more and more openly reactionary and an enemy of the proletariat. Now, you can, of course, be an enemy of the proletariat whilst waving the red flag and having a hammer and sickle tattoo and declaring that you're for the future of socialism. But by the middle 1950s, all of the major communist parties, I'll go further, all of the communist parties had objectively become enemies of the proletariat in Western Europe. All of them. They had all capitulated completely and embraced revisionism and were all racing towards becoming support mechanisms for the bourgeoisie. Just look at the actions of the Italian Communist Party in trying to force productivity deals on workers in Italian car plants back in the 70s and 80s. They were aiming to become more efficient capitalists than the capitalists themselves. And therefore, what you get is, of course, a strengthening of revisionism, not just from the internal dynamics inside the USSR, but the revisionist trend is strengthened relentlessly by the actions of the European communist parties as well. And this is very important to understand when you consider how many delusional fantasies that Gorbachev and co were able to spin about pan-European friendship and securing neutral status for Europe. These are all the delusions that were fed by the Italian and the French communist parties in particular, with their unspoken partnership with de Gaulle and their also sometimes quite openly spoken of partnership with elements within the Christian democracy in Italy. So when considering what collapses in 1991, it's important to identify it properly. What collapses in 1991 is the entire history, the entire movement of the post-war European communist parties. All of that is what feeds into the revisionism, which was an international trend. And all of that is what leads inevitably and inexorably towards the relentless weakening of the unity and purpose of the working class, the destruction of its most militant vanguards, the sowing of division within the working class, the sowing of demoralization, all of which reaches a point where when the ruling class decide that they can no longer either afford the concessions that were made in the post-45 period, and that they can now safely or by necessity need to go on the assault against the working class, the working class has no party to lead it anymore. Not in any country. Not in any country. Not in France, not in Italy, not in Spain, not in Portugal, not in Greece, not anywhere. Because when we talk about the fact that nobody arrested or shot Gorbachev in 1988 when they should have done, well, nobody was able to resist successfully the assaults that came from the ruling classes of Europe after 1965. Why? Because all of the communist parties were committed to bourgeois constitutionalism. All of the communist parties were committed to propping up the rule of the ruling class, essentially. When there was a revolutionary opportunity in Britain between the late 60s and the early 70s, what was the Communist Party leadership doing? Well, it was telling people to vote Labour and calling for an anti-monopoly alliance against the monopolistic section of the British ruling class, which is all of it, in truth. So when you had a revolutionary turn, when elements of the advanced layers of the proletariat were looking in a revolutionary direction, they found no leaders. They found nobody there to organize them. And that is ultimately what enables the ruling class to go on the assault and ultimately to prevail in the 1980s, because the leadership that existed there and fought heroic battles in the 30s and the 40s had degenerated from 1945. Victory had only led them into a land of first dogmatism, then delusion, and outright treachery. And so when we go to 1991 and we look at, well, why did it all just collapse so quickly? It is because, not just in the case that the Soviet leadership was completely rotten, even though it was, but all of the leaderships in the entire Europe-wide communist parties had reached and degenerated to the point where it was no longer possible to actually organize via those communist parties anything other than reformism and collapse, political collapse. And so that's the way to understand it more correctly, I think, rather than just chalking it up to the treacheries of Gorbachev. It is by the time you get Gorbachev, you haven't just had 30 years of degeneration, you've had 40 years of degeneration, until the point where all of these parties are adjuncts of the bourgeois political systems and have completely deviated from the revolutionary path. And that is why, of course, when the collapse comes, it comes in such a rapid and spectacular fashion, because these are not only leaderships which no longer wish to struggle, they are leaderships which increasingly were no longer, in fact, they were actively hostile to the idea of struggle against the system. Right, okay, so let's read some comments. Hello to James Graham, Dingo Ate Me Baby. Hello to CJ, yes, it's good to be back. Hello to Joe, who says, glad I'm feeling better. Well, thank you very much. Hello to Frank, and good evening to Munis. Movie Maker Joe makes a correct observation. Your health is the most important, which is true. Health is the most important thing you have, and there's no quicker way of being reminded of that than being ill. And James Graham says, I said, I met a Soviet minister early in the 80s. He was a guest of the CPB, then CPGB. They were good pals. Yes, indeed. In Paisley near Glasgow, apparently. So, I wanted to open up with that, and then I'm just going to make another couple of observations, as keeping this one relatively short, and I'll be back for a longer time tomorrow. The Ukrainians have, of course, moved into the wonderful world of James Bond type incidents again, where they have, of course, declared a great victory at sea, sinking a Russian landing craft. Now, this is undoubtedly another case where I think it's a British operation, this sinking of this Russian vessel. It was apparently done with a French cruise missile launched from a Ukrainian Su-34, I think it was. And this is it's the naval war, the war that the Ukrainians have been waging in the Black Sea. If you listen to back to the interviews that I've done with Kit Clarenberg regarding British special operations and their planning process, the areas they're obsessed with, according to his work, are of course the Kerch Bridge and the theatre of war in the Black Sea. This is where the sort of British special forces and intelligence men have been focusing their efforts. Not that, of course, it's done the Ukrainians much good. What this does, of course, is it provides a public relations incident, which is what the Ukrainian leadership would have been looking for. Things are going incredibly badly on the front lines, and I'll have more on that tomorrow. So what you need something that is going to look spectacular and look like you're still on top of things, and can feed into this narrative that the British bourgeois press have been pushing for weeks, which is this idea that the Russians have lost the sea war. I wasn't even aware that there was a sea war. What's happened is, though, that because the Ukrainians don't have a navy, they just have, of course, drones and various missiles that can be launched into the sea. The Russians haven't had any need to have like their full naval strength out there. They only need it for its missile launching capacities. And of course, the Ukrainians have been, via the assistance of the British, in particular, trying to sink as many Russian vessels as they can to claim some propaganda win. So the Russians have withdrawn a lot of their vessels to harbors that are outside of the targeting range of a lot of what the Ukrainians have available to them. So you get things like this, where the Ukrainians, with, again, this would have been done using, I think, the targeting assistance of the Brits and the Americans and maybe the French as well. They managed to sink one relatively unimportant Russian vessel. And so therefore, Zelensky and co will claim an enormous victory. They managed to down, via the launch of a Patriot air defense missile the other day, they managed to down a Russian fighter bomber as well, apparently. And again, this was big news, but then again, you compare that to the number of aircraft that the Ukrainians have lost just inside a number of days. You compare that, the sinking of this ship, to the fact the Ukrainians don't have a fleet anymore. And you can see it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. The only thing that this is designed to do is to throw a positive story into the mix for Zelensky for 24 hours, to stop his government imploding. It would seem that there are ever multiplying internal problems inside the Zelensky regime, and this is just something which is designed so that he can go on and do a broadcast saying, we are downing their aircraft, we are downing their ships, victory will be ours. And no one really believes that anymore. So it's something which is just a piece of propaganda, basically. It's nothing to do with supporting Ukrainian offensives or Ukraine being on the comeback trail or something. They are still facing a complete disaster on the front line. This is just something that was designed to give Zelensky a PR win for a few days or a few hours. And such is the nature of the war at the moment. The Ukrainians are being ground down slowly. Again, I'll cover more about this tomorrow. And the best that they can do is to have the Brits conjure up some kind of PR victory for them at sea, which again will make no difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it there for today. Not a very long one tonight, but I will be back tomorrow, where we're going to be looking at both Ukraine and occupied Palestine. Lots of things to say about that. Until then, I'll thank everybody for joining me tonight. Good to be back in the saddle, so to speak. And you can expect a longer one of these tomorrow. And I'll be back with you again then.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled, so let's begin by